They say you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink unless he's thirsty. That is invariably true. The same applies to voting. You can't make somebody vote unless they want to. I consistently get comments on videos that I do regarding voting. A lot of the comments are, I don't want to vote because it's not going to do anything. I don't need to vote. Voting doesn't do anything. Comments of that nature. Then you have the people who do want to vote, but they don't really consider their choices. But at least they make the attempt to vote, okay? Now, if you're a low information voter, you know, that's basically on you. I just want to put information out here to try to get you more informed about your vote, why you should vote, and I try to give you some information on the presidential candidates and what they're about. Now, don't get me wrong, this particular election, we got two bad choices. But sometimes you have to make a decision between two bad choices. Anyway, to all those people who basically don't see any value in their vote, let me say this to you. If there is no value to your vote, why are the Republican-led GOP states hell-bent on restricting your right to vote? Apparently, they know something that you don't, that your vote has power. Why are you going to do their job for them? As I indicated, they are hell-bent on stopping poor people, people of color, from going to the polls to exercise their right to vote. Well, some things are changing. There have been 5 states that have had their voter rights laws recently enacted struck down. Those states are North Dakota, Kansas, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Texas. I'm going to give you a little information on each of them with a specific emphasis on North Carolina because in my mind they are the most egregious. Let's start with North Dakota. A North Dakota judge ruled in favor of Native Americans on voter ID lawsuit. North Dakota became the latest state to have its voter identification law blocked by a federal court, adding to a string of recent rulings across the United States that such measures disenfranchise minority and lower income voters. Specifically on North Dakota, U.S. District Judge Daniel Hovland issued a preliminary injunction against the law on Monday, writing in his ruling that the voter ID law adds substantial and disproportionate burdens for Native American voters compared to other voters in the state. No eligible voter, regardless of their station in life, should be denied the opportunity to vote, Hovland wrote. The injunction, however, does not permanently strike down North Dakota's strict laws, which were passed by a Republican-led legislature to curb quote-unquote voter fraud, which was bullshit. Critics say such laws drive down minority or low-income voters who are more likely to not own a state-issued photo ID. 7 Native American voters filed a lawsuit against North Dakota measures which were passed in 2013 and 2015. In the lawsuit, they argued that there were too many barriers to obtain a photo ID. They said that there were no motor vehicle license offices on reservations, and many Native Americans cannot afford to obtain an ID, Social Security card, or birth certificate. It costs you money to get a birth certificate. Okay, I had to recently get one from my home state, and it costs about 30 bucks. And 30 bucks might not sound a lot to you, but to people on limited incomes, that's a lot of money. Before the Republicans in North Dakota passed its voter ID laws, a constituent could present a broad band of documents or simply take an oath affirming their identity. North Carolina Secretary of State Alvin Jaeger told the New York Times North Dakota would go back to using less restrictive identification rules that were enforced before the 2013 law was enacted. So the Native Americans in North Dakota won their suit, and it was specifically targeted against them. This ruling by the U.S. Court of Appeals is a significant victory for the Native American community in North Dakota, and obviously Native American communities across the country should be able to utilize this ruling if they have similar laws and issues. The good thing about that court ruling is if they want to appeal it, which they have already indicated that they will not, if they take it to the Supreme Court, based on the current makeup of the Supreme Court, it would end up being at the minimum 4-4 tie, which would allow the lower court ruling to remain in place. Let's go to the state of Kansas. In my mind, that law was absolutely crazy. The American Civil Liberties Union went to court to sue the state of Kansas over its voter ID law that basically forced citizens to prove their citizenship both upon registration and upon entering the voting polls. This is crazy. So that means, well, that would have meant that when you went to vote, you better have a birth certificate or a passport with you, but you couldn't use a free state issued ID. Now, how crazy is that? The ACLU also sued, claiming that the motor voter ID law passed by Congress in 1993 to raise voter registrations and promote the ease of registration was violated by the Kansas law. Fortunately, the Court of Appeals saw through this crap and decided with the voters. Now be aware, both Georgia and Alabama have similar laws to Kansas. So if there aren't lawsuits that are already being filed in those two states, there should be lawsuits filed shortly. Now, the Republican-led legislature, their claim to fame, as with all of the other states, is that they have a real issue with voter fraud. But when asked to document the issue of voter fraud, not one of them could. Not one. Voter fraud is rare and not effectively presented by voter ID laws. There was a study that was done in 2007, and it came to the conclusion that due to high financial and legal penalties, voter fraud is actually fairly uncommon, if not absent. They went on to state that when voter fraud does occur, critics of voter laws say the IDs make little difference. So for them to put all the pressure on voter IDs when it doesn't really make a hell of a lot of difference is, in a word, asinine. Let's go to Wisconsin. The federal judge Friday struck down a string of Wisconsin voting restrictions passed by their Republican-led legislature and ordered the state to revamp its voter identification laws, finding that they disenfranchised minority voters. U.S. District Judge James Peterson ruled in a legal challenge to the laws by two liberal groups. He said that he could not overturn the entire voter ID law because a federal appeals court had already found such restrictions to be constitutional. But Mr. Peterson, in his 119-page ruling, said the requirements that Wisconsin voters show either a photo identification or go through a special petition process had unfairly burdened minorities and needed to be reformed or replaced before the November presidential election. To put it bluntly, Wisconsin's strict version of voter ID law is a curse worse than a disease, the judge wrote. Peterson left the voting rules intact for the August 9th primary elections for federal, state, and local offices, saying to change them less than 2 weeks in advance would be disruptive. But his ruling was expected to impact the November presidential election in Wisconsin, which could prove a crucial battleground state for Democrat Hillary Clinton and Republican Donald Trump. Peterson also struck down an unconstitutional limit on in-person absentee voting, residency requirements, and a ban on using expired student identification. Governor Scott Walker said in a tweet he was disappointed in the decision by an activist federal judge and expected to file an appeal. Good luck, buddy, because 4-4 means that you lose. A spokesperson for the One Wisconsin Institute, one of the two groups which filed the challenge, hailed Peterson's ruling as a huge win, not only for the plaintiffs, but for democracy itself. So, goodbye, Wisconsin discriminatory voter laws. That in itself wasn't all that bad. But again, Republicans are always citing voter ID laws are needed to prevent voter fraud, but they can never substantiate their claims. The plaintiffs in the case consistently cite that the laws are intended to make it harder for poor African Americans and Latinos and poor white people to vote because they tend to vote Democratic, i.e., that's why they're targeted. Okay, that's 3. Let's go to North Carolina. North Carolina, bastion of democracy. Yeah, right. On Friday, voting rights activists scored legal victories in key presidential election states, specifically North Carolina. A unanimous decision by a 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 4th District was an overwhelming victory for the Justice Department and civil rights groups. Election law experts consider North Carolina's voter law one of the nation's most far-reaching. The evidence in this case cast doubt on the notion that voter ID laws foster integrity and confidence, the judge wrote. The North Carolina case agreed with the allocations of other cases and even went further. North Carolina's omnibus bill selectively chose voter ID requirements, reduced the number of early voting days, and changed registration procedures in ways meant to harm blacks who overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party. The new provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision and impose cures for problems that did not exist, Judge Diana Moats wrote for the panel. Thus, the asserted justifications cannot and do not conceal the state's true motivation. The rulings, along with that of a state court that halted an attempt in Kansas to require proof of citizenship to register, mark important wins for opponents of restrictive voting laws that have been challenged throughout the country ahead of November's presidential election. Put together, the decisions suggest a growing judicial suspicion of the wave of voting restriction legislation passed in recent years by Republican-led legislatures that said it was necessary to combat voter fraud. The decisions are likely to prompt the states to ask the Supreme Court for emergency action, but it is far from clear whether the 8 justices, evenly divided between conservative and liberal, would get involved. The proximity of an election is often reason for justices to let appeals court rulings stand. Federal courts have been examining what are popular and to some seemingly common sense laws requiring photo ID, for instance, to see whether they favor one group over another. In North Carolina, for instance, the judges at oral arguments noted that government-issued driver's licenses are an acceptable form of ID, but that government-issued public assistance cards used disproportionately by minorities in the state are not. Republican leaders foolishly vowed to appeal to the higher court. They issued a fiery statement denouncing the ruling by 3 partisan Democrats and suggested it was intended to help Democratic candidates for president and governor. North Carolina is considered a swing state, and African American voters have played an increasing role in making it competitive. We can only wonder if the intent is to reopen the door for voter fraud, which they can't prove, potentially allowing fellow Democratic politicians like Hillary Clinton and Roy Cooper to steal elections. No, the theft is you stopping African Americans and other minorities from voting so that you guys can steal an election. To go further, the North Carolina decision by Richmond-based court on Friday reversed a 485-page ruling by District Judge Thomas D. Schroeder that upheld the voting measures passed in 2013. North Carolina lawmakers overhauled the state's election law soon after the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder, which freed certain states from a history of discrimination, with a history of discrimination from a Voting Rights Act requirement that they receive federal approval before changing voting rules. North Carolina obviously was one of the states. Legislators quickly eliminated same-day voting registration, rolled back a week of early voting, and put an end to out-of-precinct voting. The appeals court ruling reinstates those provisions that civil rights groups led by the state's NAACP, and specifically that was a big issue as far as the Moral Monday marches that were being conducted throughout North Carolina. One of the judges wrote that Schroeder, the lower court judge, comprehensive examination of the legislature's actions seemed to have missed the forest for the trees, and because he carefully surveyed too many trees and didn't look at the forest. This failure of perspective led the court to ignore critical facts bearing on legislative intent, including the inextricable link between race and politics in North Carolina. The panel seemed to say it found the equivalent of a smoking gun before enacting that law. The legislature requested data on the use by race of a number of voting practices, Moats wrote. Upon receipt of the data, the General Assembly enacted legislation that restricted voting and registration of African Americans. Now, she also said the totality of the circumstances, North Carolina's history of voting discrimination, the surge in African American voting, the legislature's knowledge that African Americans voting translated into support for one party, and the swift elimination of the tools African Americans had used to vote and imposition of a new barrier at the first opportunity to do so, cumulatively and unmistakably revealed that the General Assembly used the law to entrench itself. Even if done for partisan ends, that constituted racial discrimination. Such a finding could have meant that the judges could order North Carolina back under federal supervision, but the panel declined to take that step, saying it was enough to block the parts of the law it found offensive. North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory issued a short statement that, like that of the legislative leader, said the decision would be appealed, and he repeated claims that the partisan cast of the panel, 3 Democratic judges, are undermining the integrity of our elections while also maligning our state. McCrory is in a tight re-election battle with Cooper, the state's Democratic Attorney General. Voting rights advocates applauded the ruling and said it sent a strong message to legislatures throughout the country. North Carolina was one of 17 states set to have more restrictive voting laws in place for this presidential election than in 2012. Laws in several states were overturned, including those in Wisconsin and Texas, and Virginia's law is currently being challenged in court. Now, let's get to the smoking gun here. Supporters of the previous law, like North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory, have long maintained that requirements like those they enacted were necessary to prevent voter fraud. But time and time again, scholars and legal experts have found that the type of fraud these laws are meant to combat is largely non-existent. One of the most comprehensive studies on the subject found only 31 individual cases of voter impersonation out of more than 1 billion votes cast in the United States since the year 2000. Researchers have found that reports of voter fraud are roughly as common as reports of alien abductions. The federal court in Richmond found that the primary purpose of North Carolina wasn't to stop voter fraud, but rather to disenfranchise minority voters. The judges found that the provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision, as I indicated before. The smoking gun in all of this was that the North Carolina lawmakers requested data on racial differences in voting behaviors in the state. That data showed that African Americans disproportionately lacked the most common kind of photo ID, those issued by the Department of Motor Vehicles. So what did they do? They made it so that you had to have an ID that was issued by the Department of Motor Vehicles. The legislators made it so that the only acceptable forms of voter IDs were the ones disproportionately used by white people. With race data in hand, the legislature amended the bill to exclude many of the alternative photo IDs used by African Americans. The bill retained only the kinds of IDs that white North Carolinians were more likely to have. Okay? The data also showed that black voters were more likely to make use of early voting, particularly the first 7 days out of North Carolina's 17-day voting period. So, of course, the lawmakers eliminated the first 7 days. After receipt of this racial data, the General Assembly amended the bill to eliminate the first week of early voting, shortening the totally early voting period from 17 days to 10. Most striking, the judges, pointing to the smoking gun in North Carolina's justification for the law proving discriminatory intent, the state argued in court that counties with Sunday voting in 2014 were disproportionately black and disproportionately Democratic, and said it did away with Sunday voting as a result of obtaining that information. Thus, in what comes as close to a smoking gun as we likely to see in modern times, the state's very justification for a challenged statute hinges explicitly on race. Specifically, it's concerned that African Americans who had overwhelmingly voted for Democrats had too much access to the franchise, the judges wrote in their decision. This is as clear-cut an indictment of the discriminatory underpinnings of voter ID laws as you'll find anywhere. Studies have already shown a significant link between support for voter ID and racial discrimination among both lawmakers and white voters in general. Faced with this record, the federal court concludes we can only conclude that the North Carolina General Assembly enacted the challenged provisions of the law with discriminatory intent. Governor McCrory said that photo IDs are required to purchase Sudafed, cash a check, board an airplane, or enter a federal courtroom. Yet 3 Democratic judges are undermining the integrity of our elections while also maligning our state. We will immediately appeal and also review other potential options. He ain't going to win on this one. He's not going to win on this one. But he's going to try to take it to the nth degree in order to try to hold those discriminatory voter laws in place. He can't win because appealing to the Supreme Court at the most will result in a 4-4 deadlock. But the Supreme Court has a history of not taking cases involving voter law issues as close to a national election as we currently are. Now, if you weren't aware of it, prior to this past week, Texas's law was struck down. And that was done by a conservative appeals court. Texas issued an unexpected decision for one of the most conservative conservative federal appeals courts in the country. The full United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit handed down a decision on Wednesday holding that a Texas voter suppression law violates the Voting Rights Act. The court heard this case en banc, a rarely invoked process where a full appeals court, as opposed to a panel of 3 judges, meets to decide a case. The vote was 9-6, although the majority split on whether to uphold a lower court's finding that Texas acted with discriminatory intent in enacting this law. Voter ID laws are a common restriction on voting which are often favored by conservative lawmakers. Ostensibly, they address an exceedingly rare phenomenon, voter fraud at the polls. And I do mean exceedingly rare. A Wisconsin study, for example, found just 7 cases among the 3 million votes cast in the state's 2004 election, and none were the kind of fraud that would have been prevented by a voter ID law. Similarly, in 2014, Iowa Secretary of State Matt Schultz conducted a 2-year investigation into election misconduct within his state. He uncovered 0 cases of in-person voter fraud. Laws requiring voters to show photo IDs in order to vote do create an obstacle to the franchise that is particularly likely to impact racial minorities, low-income voters, students, and other groups that tend to vote Democratic. If the current laws, and I'm done telling you about Texas, other than to say that people that were required to get IDs in the state of Texas, in one case, and I'm going to outline this particular one, the law Texas law raised serious obstacles between many voters and the polls. One voter had the help of his son in attempting to obtain an SB-14 ID card, but they faced an almost impossible bureaucratic morass when they tried to get the required underlying documentation. Another was unable to obtain ID because he was unable to get his Louisiana birth certificate unless he paid $81. Still others face hour-long one-way trips to reach the nearest Department of Public Safety office or a 60-mile round-trip ride to the nearest DPS station. Texas was a piece of work. Trying to get any kind of ID in the state of Texas, unless you were born and raised here, is a journey damn near too far. But again, this is their attempt. Now, there are other things that are being done. I forget the state, but if I were gonna bet money, I would think it was somewhere near North Carolina that the department responsible for voter registration and maintaining the polls sent letters out to predominantly black people telling them that they must appear at the courthouse in order to confirm their identity. Now, these notices went out by mail to the addresses that were on file. They had to issue a response. When they didn't issue a response, guess what? Police officers were sent to their residences. If that is not voter intimidation, I don't know what is. So, in closing, they're working hard to stop people from voting. Don't do their job for them. I don't care who you want to vote for. Get out there, register, and vote.